very much for inviting me on behalf of UN Women to provide some reflections on the Beijing Plus 20 review. I would like to start maybe by saying something a little bit personal about myself, because I think all of our gender work is influenced by where we are placed within a society. So I feel like I'm neither young nor old. I have been a student, like many of you are today, when Beijing Plus 20 was happening. I have not myself participated, but I have participated on behalf of the NGO community in Switzerland in the various reviews of the Beijing process. And being myself an expert on peace-building issues, I hope that the outcome of the Beijing Plus 20 review is a two-way process amongst ourselves, where we come up with a framework which can be used by every nation around the globe to advance issues of women's empowerment and gender equality. And likewise, my previous speakers, I think it's extremely important to reach out to young people like you are and to get your inputs in how inequalities can be removed, to bring in some of the new issues that have come along our way in terms of gender equality, to bring in much more a focus on women with disabilities, to bring in issues around the LGBT community, to integrate all of those new issues into the agenda that we are together forming as we speak. So now, after this a little bit more personal introduction, I would like to provide you some comments and an overview of the UN Women's role and what the UN does in terms of Beijing Plus 20 and the review in the General Assembly this autumn. So I'm very, very happy to be part of this very, very meaningful workshop today. And it's very important that we commemorate this 20th milestone of the Beijing Platform for Action. As you know, the 4th UN World Conference on Women held in Beijing in '95 saw the coming together of UN member states, UN agencies, and over 5,000 delegates from civil society and the women's movement globally. And in that sense, it was historic to bring together all these different stakeholders in one room. From India, I know that, and from whole of South Asia, for the first time, a huge delegation of well over 200 activists, practitioners, and researchers went together to Beijing to lobby their governments for committing to women's rights in the region. I have heard that India had a huge delegation, one of the biggest ones in Beijing during that time, so it was a really big moment of mobilization of the women's movement to voice its concerns vis-à-vis the UN, in a UN space vis-à-vis their governments. And I met several government officials, including the foreign minister, the minister of minority affairs. They all have been to Beijing. So I think it's a very nice way how to connect with these senior leaders, because they have been there themselves and they have experienced that moment of solidarity. So as we prepare for the next Commission on the Status of Women, which will happen in March in New York, and it will be fully focused on the Beijing Plus 20 review, and then later on the review in the United Nations General Assembly, it's time to look back and celebrate the many gains that have been made, but also to look forward what we have not achieved and what new issues need to be integrated into the women's empowerment and gender equality agenda for the next few years. This movement is particularly important because 2015 marks the dawning of a new area of development goals. The global community is gearing up to adopt in the General Assembly in September, at the same time as the Beijing +20 review, what is being proposed as the Sustainable Development Goals. UN Women, Women's Movement, and the technical support provided to the open working group, which is crafting those Sustainable Development Goals, have drafted the proposed goals with huge contributions by civil society, and for the first time with a consultative process that the UN has facilitated in many countries around the world. Because one of the criticisms of the current Millennium Development Goals that we're still implementing is that they were a little too top-down and they have not come out of a consultation. So the UN, on behalf of member states, has been asked last year to conduct comprehensive consultations in around 50 countries around the world. At that time, I was in Vietnam, and we consulted the civil society, including youth, what their thoughts were for these Sustainable Development Goals. Now, from the gender perspective, as you may all know, UN Women, together with the governments, supported the gender equality concerns and civil society, we have lobbied to have a standalone goal on gender equality and women's empowerment, which is now likely to come in that Sustainable Development Agenda as Goal 5. And we're very pleased that the government of India is very much standing behind a standalone goal on gender equality. Now, how is this goal different from goal number 3 of the Millennium Development Goals, which was also in gender equality? This new goal is different because for the first time it acknowledges the need to report and reduce instances of violence against women and girls. That focus was completely absent from the current MDGs. So the new goal is also speaking of recognizing, reducing, and redistributing women's unpaid work. It promotes ensuring women's access, control, and ownership over productive resources. It also targets the elimination of all harmful practices, such as child, early, and forced marriage, and female genital mutilation. And these are just a few examples how these new goals are trying to capture important issues that have either not been captured or that have been developed as important gender issues over the last 20 years. So these goals have grown out of debates and assessments of Beijing. Many of these criteria did not exist in the MDG generation 15 years ago. So thanks to our collective efforts, there is no way the post-MDG generation can ignore them. In terms of UN Women, we have consistently advocated for the transformative standalone goal on women's rights, gender equality, and empowerment. Now, as you may have heard, and those of you who follow the debates around the Sustainable Development Goals, there is an attempt to have indicators against which progress can be measured, because it is felt that the MDG indicators are too reductionist in the way they measure progress. So what UN Women did is that we have proposed 3 key indicators of progress to measure gender equality and women's empowerment. The first one is security and freedom from violence. The second one is access to resources and opportunity. And the third one is around voice, agency, and leadership. Now the challenge ahead of us is to see how these are translated into concrete indicators in the SDG framework with measurable targets and dedicated resources to back them. We developed this framework through the numerous consultative processes with feminists and women's movements in many parts of the world, our partners, our allies, and civil society advisory groups at various levels, and as well with government and intergovernmental partners. What you may also be aware of is that as part of the development of the new post-2015 framework, UN Women, together with UNICEF, led the global discussion on inequalities. This is one of the other important shifts that we're trying to make, that we're trying to move away from talking about poverty, but talking about inequality, and through the removal of inequality, eradicate poverty. So to have SDGs which are more rights-based rather than charity-based. So I think that's another very important new element of the SDG. Just to refer to some of our UN normative frameworks, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women has given us the principle of substantive equality. Those of you who are lawyers are experts on these matters. And we know that simply ensuring equality in access and opportunity is insufficient to bring about changes in societies and economies. Ensuring equality in outcomes requires special efforts to address structural forms of marginalization, discrimination, and violence, be it on the basis of caste, class, religion, age, ability, region, marital status, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Learning from this, moving forward, I urge you all to give special attention to voices from the margins that we have so far not included in our discussions. As I already said, I think it's very important to bring you, the young people, into this discussion and consultation, and I encourage you to include voices and experiences of young people in all of your initiatives. Intergenerational exchange and learning can only strengthen our movements and can help us emerge as a power to reckon with. And I think is also very important, this intergenerational dialogue, to discuss a more equitable distribution of resources amongst the young population versus the older population. At least in my country, most of the wealth is held by the older generation versus the younger generation does not have as much savings, as much property, as much entitlements as the older ones, and I think that's a struggle that is ongoing, which shows itself in this various social policies that are currently debated, especially in those countries who already have those policies. The youth is very active in terms of advocating that they are not getting enough of a share from those policies that are already in place. So that is a very, very big focus of debate nowadays, at least in my country. So as you may also know, we have, and it has been mentioned as part of the Beijing +20 review, we have supported various specific reviews of the Beijing Platform for Action to feed into the SDG discussion. There is a global report that UN Women produced last year, and in various, we're now finalizing a regional report on the Beijing +20 review to come up with some key challenges for the region, and we, at the national level, last year we have also been associated with the national consultation that was already mentioned, and I'm pleased to also share with you that we're just finalizing a national report on the implementation of India vis-à-vis the Beijing Platform for Action from a civil society perspective. So in addition to the report from the conference last year, we will soon have a publication from the perspective of civil society on all 12 critical areas in India, what has been achieved and what are the key challenges. So I encourage you to use those documents. We've tried to make them as practical as they can become, by including a few recommendations in each area that the civil society felt needs to be put forward. So we will make sure we share this report with you, and I encourage you to use it in your own discussions and in your formulation of your own youth platform for the Beijing +20. As you also know, and it was already mentioned, there has been at the Asia-Pacific level, under the umbrella of ESCAP, a review of the Beijing +20 in Bangkok in November 2014. Let me just share, some of the insights into that, into the conclusions that came out from that interministerial meeting. First of all, UN Women and ESCAP together ensured a strong recommitment by member states to gender equality and women's empowerment, including the commitment for financing for women's rights, ensuring accountability of governments towards women's rights and gender equality, strategic partnerships, and the continued focus on gender mainstreaming across all sectors. So these were some of the achievements. Now maybe some of the challenges with that ministerial declaration. We feel that there was not enough progress on the rights of women with disabilities, those living with HIV, those in rural areas, or youth voices. So that declaration is unfortunately not that strong in terms of representing youth. Also, sexual and reproductive health and rights and concerns of vulnerable communities, such as Dalit, were not given adequate attention in the final ministerial declaration. So this means that in South Asia and in India, we will have to work harder on some of these concerns. And just to share a kind of personal reflection coming from a so-called developed country, I think we are all, looking at things maybe not in a complex enough way. And I think you in India have a much more refined lens in terms of looking at what you call intersectionality and how gender, caste, race comes together and defines the patterns of discrimination an individual is faced with. Being myself, educated woman, typically, what the middle class European woman would advocate for vis-a-vis her government is for equal pay, for creches, and we would all be more or less on the same page. And all of these issues that countries like India are facing may actually fall through the cracks, even seen from a feminist perspective from a European angle. So I encourage you very much to bring up these issues of inequality, intersectionality. I think in the so-called developed world, what is very much emerging is our struggle to integrate migrant population into our societies. And I think what happened last week, in France is a sign of, desperate youth becoming, brainwashed and being used for these terrible attacks. And I think that is the challenge, and perhaps, where we have to reflect further how can we share all that wealth that we have with everybody who lives in a nation, regardless of where they come from. And I hope that all of these issues will also be discussed as part of the Beijing +20, so that we have a platform that can be used equally by others. So in conclusion, I think I also encourage you to touch upon those very sensitive issues, those issues we don't maybe like to talk so much about, and which are hard for governments to address, but I think if it comes from the youth from different angles, then maybe we will be able to come up with something which is more inclusive in the field of gender equality. And for these SDGs that I have talked about, that will also be an important milestone next year. So I look very much forward to listening to all of you and to go back, come out of this consultation with some more ideas on what type of work also we as UN Women can do with youth, with no men and boys. We've just launched a campaign which is called He for She, where we try to engage with, a larger constituency, reaching out to men and boys and hear their voices on, how to tackle inequalities, to get them on board as partners against violence against women, against, discrimination in general. To rediscuss some of these, I think it comes down to what I think is the core of feminism, how to break down power and privilege, and how to share power and privilege better so that we all benefit from what, countries and resources have to offer to everybody so that we can live in a peaceful environment, which I think is very important in the time to come in a much more complex world. So I really look forward to today's discussion, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.